In 1850, Cornelius Vanderbilt was running a steamboat business in New York Harbor. Not railroads, steamboats. He had spent 4 full decades, 40 years, hauling passengers and freight across water, not land. He was 56 years old, semi-retired, worth maybe 3 or 4 million, comfortable, wealthy by any reasonable standard, but not legendary, not empire-building wealthy, not reshaping the American economy wealthy. 20 years later, by 1870, he controlled nearly every major railroad line between New York and Chicago. He had built the largest private fortune in American history up to that point, bigger than John Jacob's fur trading empire, bigger than what Rockefeller had accumulated at that stage, bigger than what Carnegie would have for another decade. And he did it all after the age most men retire, after the age when most entrepreneurs have already cashed out and stepped back. But here's what the history books won't tell you, what the business school case studies conveniently leave out. Vanderbilt didn't build those railroads. He didn't lay a single mile of track, engineer a single bridge, or pioneer a single new route. He stole them through stock manipulation schemes that would be federal crimes today, through bribed politicians who changed laws to suit his interests, and through corporate warfare so brutal, so ruthless, so systematically devastating that it would make modern activist investors and hedge fund raiders look like amateurs. The Vanderbilt fortune wasn't built on innovation. It wasn't built on better service, superior technology, or visionary leadership. It was built on financial terrorism, on monopoly power, and on exploiting every loophole in an unregulated capitalist system. This is the story of how one man weaponized capitalism itself, and how everyone else just stood there and watched him do it. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, then a sleepy farming community across the water from Manhattan, to a family of Dutch settlers who couldn't even afford to keep him in school past age 11. His father, Cornelius Sr., ran a small ferry service, basically a rowboat operation, carrying farmers and their produce to Manhattan markets. Nothing glamorous, nothing that suggested the family would one day be synonymous with American wealth. By 16, young Cornelius had borrowed $100 from his mother to buy his own sailing vessel. The deal was simple. He would run cargo and passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan, undercut the competition on price, work longer hours than anyone else, and split the profits with his mother until the loan was paid back. Standard bootstrap entrepreneurship. For the next 40 years, from 1810 to 1850, he did exactly that. He expanded aggressively. He built more boats, bigger boats, faster steamboats. Once that technology emerged in the 1820s, he undercut competitors so aggressively they called him a pirate. He fought rate wars, slashing fares to unprofitable levels just to drive rivals out of business, then raising prices once the competition was dead. He eventually dominated New York Harbor's steamboat traffic, ran routes up the Hudson River, operated ferry lines across Long Island Sound, but he was still just a guy who owned boats. A successful businessman, yes, wealthy by normal standards, but not an empire builder. Not yet. The thing people miss about Vanderbilt, the thing that explains everything that came after, is that he didn't care about being respectable. The wealthy families of New York, the old money aristocracy, the heirs and the Livingstons and the Rhinelanders, they looked down on him. He was rough, uneducated, prone to cursing in business meetings and spitting tobacco juice on carpeted floors. His language was coarse. His manners were worse. He didn't go to their charity balls. He didn't marry into their families. He didn't play their games. He made his money moving people and cargo, and he did it with ruthless efficiency and zero pretense about being anything other than what he was. A working-class kid from Staten Island who had clawed his way to wealth by being meaner, tougher, and more willing to destroy competitors than anyone else in the game. By 1850, he had accumulated somewhere between $3 and $4 million, enough to retire comfortably, buy a mansion, live off the interest for the rest of his life. And that's exactly what he tried to do. He took his family on a grand tour of Europe, spent a full year traveling, seeing the sights, playing the wealthy American tourist. But while he was gone, his business partners back in New York started making moves. They thought Vanderbilt was done, thought he had lost his edge, thought he was ready to fade into comfortable retirement. So they started squeezing him out of his own steamboat companies, diluting his ownership stakes, cutting him out of decision-making, basically treating him like a has-been. They thought wrong. Vanderbilt came back from Europe in 1851, absolutely furious. That fury, that sense of betrayal, that wounded pride became the fuel for everything that followed. He didn't just fight to get his steamboat company back. He declared total war on the entire industry. He slashed fares so low that competitors couldn't possibly match them without operating at massive losses. He built faster ships, more luxurious ships, and ran them at a loss for months, sometimes years, just to destroy anyone who had crossed him. Within 2 years, by 1853, he had bankrupted most of his rivals and consolidated almost complete control over New York Harbor's steamboat traffic. But here's where the story pivots, where Vanderbilt transforms from successful businessman into something else entirely. By 1852, Vanderbilt was in his late 50s and starting to see something his competitors didn't, couldn't, or refused to see. Steamboats were dying. Not immediately, not overnight, but the long-term trend was unmistakable. Railroads were faster, more reliable, could run in winter when rivers froze, and could go places water would never reach. The Erie Canal had already proven that inland transport was the future of American commerce. That the real money wasn't in moving goods along coastlines, but in connecting the interior of the continent to the ports. Most men his age would have cashed out, sold the steamboat empire while it was still generating revenue, locked in their wealth, and retired to mansions in Manhattan or Newport. Vanderbilt did the opposite. He started buying railroad stock, and not just as a passive investment. He was studying the industry, learning who owned what, figuring out where the leverage points were, identifying which properties mattered and which ones didn't. At first, it looked like just another rich man's portfolio diversification. He bought shares in the New York and Harlem Railroad, a small commuter line running from Lower Manhattan up to Harlem, about 8 miles of track. Nothing impressive. A local operation that barely turned a profit, carried passengers to and from work, hauled some light freight. Wall Street didn't even notice, but Vanderbilt wasn't buying the New York and Harlem Railroad because he thought passenger rail was the future, or because he believed in the management team, or because he liked the financials. He was buying it because he understood something fundamental about capitalism that most people still don't grasp today. Something that applies just as much to tech platforms and telecommunications infrastructure as it did to railroads in the 1850s. You don't make money by building things. You make money by controlling things. Specifically, by controlling bottlenecks, choke points, the unavoidable nodes in a network that everyone has to pass through. The New York and Harlem Railroad owned something absolutely priceless. It owned the legal right, granted by the New York State Legislature back in the 1830s, to run tracks down Broadway directly into Lower Manhattan. Every other railroad trying to reach New York City from the north had to stop miles outside the city limits, in villages like Harlem or Yonkers, and transfer passengers and freight to fies or horse-drawn carriages for the final leg into the city. But the Harlem line went straight into the heart of the financial district, straight to where the banks, trading houses, and shipping companies were located. Vanderbilt saw the angle immediately. If he controlled the only railroad with direct access to Manhattan, he could charge whatever he wanted. He didn't need to run the best trains. He didn't need to offer the best service. He didn't need to compete on price, quality, or innovation. He just needed to own the choke point, own the last mile, control the access. So he started accumulating shares quietly at first. He'd buy a few hundred shares through intermediaries, wait for the price to drop when other investors sold, to buy more. He never made public announcements about his intentions. He never issued statements about taking control or reforming management. He just kept buying patiently, methodically, until he owned enough stock to control the board of directors. By 1863, 12 years after he had started buying, he controlled the New York and Harlem Railroad completely. He owned a majority stake, appointed his own board, and ran the company however he saw fit. That's when he made his first move, the move that would establish his reputation as the most ruthless financial operator in America. The New York State Legislature was debating a bill in 1863 to extend the Harlem Railroad tracks further south into Manhattan, all the way down to the Battery, the southern tip of the island. It would have been a massive windfall for the company, opening up new routes, new customers, new revenue streams. Stock prices were already rising on rumors of the bill passing, on speculation that the legislature would approve the extension. And Vanderbilt knew something no one else did. The bill was going to fail. Not because it was bad policy, not because there was genuine opposition, but because Vanderbilt had bribed half the state legislature to vote against it. Here's how the scheme worked. And it's important because Vanderbilt would use variations of this playbook for the next decade. Vanderbilt quietly approached certain state legislators, offered them cash payments, and told them the plan. They would publicly support the railroad extension bill, give speeches on the legislative floor about how good it would be for New York, how it would improve commerce and create jobs. That public support would drive up stock prices as investors assumed the bill would pass. The legislators agreed. They made their speeches. They drummed up enthusiasm. Stock prices soared. Investors piled in, buying Harlem Railroad shares at inflated prices, thinking the extension was a sure thing, a guaranteed win. Then, right before the final vote, the bribed legislators flipped. They voted against the bill. It failed. Stock prices collapsed overnight. Investors who had bought at the peak, who had leveraged themselves, betting on the extension, lost everything. And Vanderbilt? He had been selling his shares at those inflated prices the whole time, dumping stock onto eager buyers who thought they were getting in on a sure thing. He made millions, but he wasn't done. After the crash, when Harlem Railroad stock was trading for a fraction of its former value, when panicked investors were dumping shares just to cut their losses, Vanderbilt bought it all back. Every share he had sold, plus every share that desperate sellers were offering. Within weeks, he owned even more of the company than before the scheme started. He had manufactured a boom, profited from the bust, and consolidated his control, all perfectly legal, or at least not clearly illegal, given how vague securities laws were in the 1860s. Wall Street was furious. Newspapers ran editorials calling him a manipulator and a cheat. Investors who had been burned demanded investigations, but nothing happened. Bribing legislators wasn't a crime. Stock manipulation wasn't even a well-defined concept yet. Vanderbilt had operated entirely within the gaps in the law, exploiting the fact that there simply weren't rules against what he had done, and he was just getting started. That Harlem Railroad scam was a proof of concept, a demonstration of what was possible when you combined monopoly control, political influence, and complete disregard for anything resembling fair play. The next target was bigger: the New York Central Railroad. The New York Central was the prize everyone wanted. The railroad, every major investor and industrialist in America was trying to get their hands on. It connected Albany to Buffalo, running about 300 miles along the Erie Canal route, cutting straight across upstate New York. Whoever controlled the Central controlled access to the Great Lakes, to Cleveland and Detroit, and Chicago, the entire Midwest. It was the most valuable railroad corridor in America, and everyone knew it. But the New York Central wasn't one railroad. That's the part most histories gloss over. It was a chaotic patchwork of 10 smaller lines, each incorporated separately, each with different owners, different management teams, different gauge tracks. The Albany and Schenectady Railroad, the Utica and Schenectady Railroad, the Syracuse and Utica Railroad, the Rochester and Syracuse Railroad, the Tonawanda Railroad, the Buffalo and Rochester Railroad, and 4 others. A passenger traveling from Albany to Buffalo had to switch trains at least 5 times, sometimes more. You'd board a train in Albany, ride it to Schenectady, get off, wait for the next train, transfer all your luggage and cargo, board the next train, ride to Utica, and do it all over again. Every junction meant delays, lost baggage, missed connections, mud, and additional costs. It was inefficient, expensive, and absolutely maddening for shippers trying to move freight across the state. But consolidating those 10 lines into one unified company required buying out dozens of shareholders, negotiating with competing interests, and convincing everyone to agree on terms. It had been attempted multiple times. It had failed every time. Vanderbilt saw an opportunity. If he could consolidate those 10 lines into one unified system, he would control the entire route from Albany to Buffalo. But buying all 10 companies outright would cost more money than even he had. So he didn't buy them, he starved them. By 1867, Vanderbilt already controlled 2 key railroads. He still owned the New York and Harlem Railroad, running from Manhattan to Harlem. And he had acquired the Hudson River Railroad, which ran north from Manhattan along the Hudson River to Albany, about 140 miles of track. Every single passenger or freight shipment heading west from New York City had to pass through Albany. There was no alternative route, and Vanderbilt controlled the only 2 railroads that could get them there. So Vanderbilt made a calculated decision, a move so aggressive and anti-competitive that it would trigger regulatory backlash decades later. He refused to connect his railroads to the New York Central system. He refused to coordinate schedules. He refused to allow seamless transfers. He refused to negotiate combined freight rates. Imagine being a business trying to ship goods from New York to Chicago in 1867. You'd load your cargo onto one of Vanderbilt's trains, either the Harlem or the Hudson River line, travel to Albany, then have to physically unload everything, hire wagons or carts to haul it across town to a different station, reload it onto a New York Central train, and only then continue west. It added hours to every trip, sometimes full days, depending on how long it took to coordinate the transfers. And it cost a fortune. Vanderbilt was charging premium rates for his lines. The transfer itself required hiring, labor, and equipment. And then the Central was charging its own rates. Businesses were furious. Shippers demanded that Vanderbilt and the Central work out a connection agreement. They demanded that the railroads cooperate instead of forcing customers to bear the cost of their rivalry. Vanderbilt refused because he didn't want cooperation. He wanted capitulation. He wanted the owners of those 10 fractured Central Railroad companies to come to him, desperate and willing to sell. And it worked. By late 1867, the New York Central system was hemorrhaging money. Shippers were finding alternate routes, using the Erie Railroad or shipping via the Great Lakes. Passengers were avoiding the Central entirely, choosing slower but less chaotic alternatives. Stock prices collapsed as investors realized the Central couldn't compete as long as Vanderbilt controlled access to Albany. Vanderbilt started buying shares quietly through intermediaries, using the same playbook he had used with the Harlem Railroad. He never announced his intentions. He just accumulated stock month after month, buying from panicked sellers who saw no future for the company. By 1868, he owned enough to force a consolidation. The 10 separate companies were merged into one unified New York Central Railroad with standardized track gauge, unified management, coordinated schedules, and Vanderbilt controlled it all. Now he owned a continuous railroad line from New York City to Buffalo. He immediately started making changes. He standardized the track gauge so trains didn't have to switch at junctions anymore. He upgraded the engines and rolling stock, bought newer and faster equipment. He cut costs by firing redundant administrative staff and renegotiating supplier contracts. But most importantly, he raised rates. With no real competition on the New York to Buffalo route, With control over the only efficient way to move freight and passengers across upstate New York, he could charge whatever he wanted, and shippers had no choice but to pay. This is where revisionist history matters, where the standard narrative taught in business schools completely falls apart. The usual story is that Vanderbilt was a brilliant industrialist who built a transportation empire through efficiency, innovation, and smart capital allocation. That he saw the future of railroads before anyone else, invested wisely, improved operations, and earned his fortune through superior management. That's not what happened. Vanderbilt built his empire through monopoly power and financial manipulation. He used his control of key choke points to squeeze competitors until they collapsed, then bought their assets for pennies on the dollar. He bribed politicians to block legislation that would have opened up competition or regulated his rates. He manipulated stock prices to fleece investors and consolidate ownership. The efficiency and innovation came after he had already secured monopoly control. Once he owned the entire route, sure, he made improvements. He upgraded infrastructure, streamlined operations, reduced costs. But those improvements weren't what built the empire. They were what he did with the empire once he had stolen it, and he wasn't done. The next target was even bigger. The Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway connected Buffalo to Chicago, about 540 miles of track, running along the southern shore of Lake Erie, through Ohio and Indiana. If Vanderbilt could control that line, he'd have an unbroken railroad from New York to the heart of the Midwest, a continuous corridor that no one else could match. The Lakeshore Railway was owned by a syndicate of investors based in Cleveland and Chicago. They knew exactly what Vanderbilt was planning. They had watched him devour the New York Central. They had seen his tactics, his ruthlessness, his willingness to destroy value just to gain control. They weren't going to sell not willingly, so Vanderbilt did what he always did. He made their railroad worthless, then bought it cheap. He started running his New York Central trains on schedules that deliberately missed connections with Lakeshore trains. A Central train carrying passengers heading to Chicago would arrive in Buffalo at 8:05 a.m., 5 minutes after the Lakeshore train had departed at 8 a.m. every single day. Passengers were furious. They missed their connections, had to wait hours or sometimes a full day for the next train, pay for hotels, rebook tickets, and blamed the Lakeshore Railway for poor scheduling, for not coordinating with the Central, for running an incompetent operation. Then Vanderbilt went further. He instructed his ticket agents to actively steer passengers away from Lakeshore trains. If someone came to a New York Central station asking for a ticket to Chicago, the agent would recommend alternate routes that involved more transfers, higher total fares, longer travel times, but at least avoided the scheduling chaos that Vanderbilt himself had deliberately created. The Lakeshore's revenue started dropping. Investors got nervous. Stock prices declined. The Lakeshore owners tried to fight back. They sued Vanderbilt for anti-competitive practices, arguing that deliberately missing connections violated common carrier obligations. They lobbied state legislators in New York and Ohio, tried to get laws passed that would force railroad coordination. They launched newspaper campaigns accusing Vanderbilt of sabotaging their business. None of it worked. The lawsuits got tied up in jurisdictional fights between New York and Ohio courts. The legislators were either bribed or intimidated. The newspaper campaigns just made Vanderbilt look like a victim of business rivals spreading lies. By 1869, the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway was on the verge of bankruptcy. Vanderbilt made his move. He didn't buy the whole company at first. He bought just enough shares to control the board of directors and installed his own management team to dictate terms. Then he negotiated a merger with his New York Central system, combining the two railroads into one integrated operation. The merger was announced in late 1869. Suddenly, Vanderbilt controlled a continuous railroad line from New York to Chicago, the most valuable transportation corridor in America, and he had acquired it all in less than a decade, most of it after turning 60. By 1870, one man controlled nearly every major railroad between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes. If you wanted to ship freight or travel by rail from New York to Chicago, you had essentially one choice: Vanderbilt's railroad. Sure, there were technically other routes, but they were slower, less reliable, required multiple transfers. Vanderbilt had created the first true monopoly in American railroading. He had done it through tactics that were technically legal, but morally indefensible. The brutality of how he built that empire is almost never discussed in mainstream histories. Instead, you get the myth of the self-made man, the poor boy who borrowed $100 and built an empire through hard work, vision, and determination. The archetype of American entrepreneurship. The reality is much darker, much more cynical, and much more instructive if you actually want to understand how capitalism works in the absence of regulation. Vanderbilt built his empire by weaponizing the lack of rules in American capitalism. He exploited loopholes, bribed officials, used monopoly power to crush anyone who stood in his way. When the government finally started regulating railroads in the 1870s and 1880s, when the Interstate Commerce Act was passed in 1887, it was a direct response to the abuses that Vanderbilt and a few other railroad barons had pioneered. The regulations didn't come from some abstract belief in government oversight. They came because Vanderbilt and his competitors had so thoroughly abused their power, had so blatantly rigged the system in their favor, that even a largely pro-business government couldn't ignore it anymore. By January of 1877, when Cornelius Vanderbilt died at age 82, he was worth approximately $105 million. In today's money, adjusting for inflation and economic growth, that's somewhere in the range of $300 billion. Richer than Jeff Bezos at his peak, richer than Elon Musk, the wealthiest private individual in American history up to that point. He left almost the entire fortune to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, cutting out his other children with relatively modest inheritances. William doubled the fortune within a decade, expanding the railroad empire and investing in emerging industries. The Vanderbilt family remained one of the richest in America for the next 2 generations. They built mansions in Newport and on Fifth Avenue, mansions so lavish they became tourist attractions, the Breakers, Marble House, and more. They endowed universities, funded hospitals, collected European art, but the fortune didn't last. By the 1970s, less than 100 years after Cornelius died, there wasn't a single Vanderbilt left among the wealthiest Americans. The money had been divided among heirs, spent on lavish lifestyles, lost through bad investments and market crashes. When a direct descendant was asked about the family fortune, they said there was nothing left. The empire his great-great-great-grandfather had built through monopoly and manipulation had evaporated. Not because the railroad business collapsed, but because the heirs spent the money faster than it could regenerate. The Vanderbilt story is usually told as a cautionary tale about wealth and excess, about how fortunes built in one generation can be squandered by the next, about the dangers of idle rich children who never learn to work, never learn the value of money. But that completely misses the point. The real lesson isn't about spending or inheritance. The real lesson is about how fortunes are built in the first place. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't get rich by working harder than everyone else. He didn't invent railroads or pioneer new technologies or create something that didn't exist before. He got rich by understanding that in an unregulated market, monopoly power beats innovation every single time. He got rich by exploiting the system, by bending rules that barely existed, by using his wealth to rig the game in his favor. Once he had that monopoly power, once he controlled the choke points, he didn't need to be the best. He didn't need to offer the best service, the lowest prices, or the most innovative solutions. He just needed to control access. He could charge whatever he wanted, run his railroads however he wanted, crush any competitor who dared to challenge him. That's the story they don't teach in business schools. That's the revisionist history buried under myths about hard work, vision, and the American dream. The Vanderbilts weren't nobody before 1850. They were already wealthy. Cornelius was already a millionaire several times over, but they became legends and became synonymous with American capitalism itself by turning capitalism into a weapon and wielding it with absolutely zero mercy. The railroad empire Vanderbilt built still exists today, in fragments and pieces. The New York Central eventually merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1968 to form Penn Central, which went spectacularly bankrupt in 1970, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time. The assets were absorbed into Conrail, a government-backed corporation, which was later privatized and split between CSX and Norfolk Southern. The tracks are still there, carrying freight across the same routes Vanderbilt fought for. The routes are still valuable, still essential to American commerce, but the Vanderbilt name is gone from the industry. The fortune is gone. The family exists now only in history books and museum placards. And the lesson remains clearer than ever if you're willing to see it. You don't build an empire by playing fair. You don't build generational wealth through innovation or hard work or superior products. You build it by controlling the choke points, by exploiting the system before anyone writes rules to stop you, by crushing anyone who stands in your way. That's how the Vanderbilts did it. That's how every robber baron did it. That's how it's always been. Kermon Long Nghe. Comment, like, subscribe, nếu thấy hữu ích hãy góp ý cho chúng tôi.